The OnePlus 10 Pro is finally with us, 2 months after it launched in China and almost 3 months since it was officially announced. So this phone, although it is brand new, feels pretty familiar already, and not just because it's been available for a while in another part of the world. The core formula of a high-end OnePlus phone hasn't changed too much, with software based on Oppo's ColorOS, a camera tuned by Hasselblad, and of course ridiculously fast charging. And in another trademark OnePlus move, it's selling at a price that tries to undercut the competition from companies like Samsung and Google, starting at $799 here in the UK and $899 in the US. Not cheap, but also not crazy ultra flagship money. So it's time to look at whether it's worth it at this price, and whether, after a pretty tumultuous year, OnePlus's flagship still has what it takes to compete in 2022. Take a sec to subscribe to Android Central for more reviews like this one, and we'll jump in. So your base model OnePlus 10 Pro, which sells for $799 in the UK or $899 in the US, comes with 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage, along with the typical Android flagship specs: Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor, dual SIM support, and pretty decent in-screen fingerprint plus face unlock. And being a OnePlus phone, that trusty alert slider is also at your disposal. So that base model gets you a pretty complete flagship package, or you can spend £100 or €100 more to get 12GB of RAM plus 256GB of storage. That is, unless you're in the US, where the 12 plus 256 won't be available at launch. And that's not the only regional caveat around this phone, there's also a bit of weirdness going on with water resistance. The T-Mobile US version of the 10 Pro will carry an IP68 rating, but the others won't, which is a downgrade from the 9 Pro, which had IP68 across the board. Obviously these phones are all physically the same, so it'll likely be just fine around water even if you're using one of the ones without an IP rating, but still it is something to be aware of. Of course, we've known what the OnePlus 10 Pro looks like for a few months now, but it's worth saying once again OnePlus has switched up its design language. Around the back there's this very prominent stovetop camera module with a trio of lenses plus that LED flash. It's tempting to say this is a copycat of last year's Galaxy S21 Ultra from Samsung, but in reality the OnePlus camera bulge is much less bulgy than that model, only sticks out a little bit from the surface of the back panel. And that back panel feels like something of a tribute to the earliest OnePlus phones. The finish is matte, in fact extremely matte. It feels a lot softer than the typical frosted glass you might get on, say, a Samsung phone. But beneath the surface there's this speckled reflective pattern that brings back memories of the old sandstone backs of vintage OnePlus phones. It's pretty striking when it catches the light like this. Some recent OnePlus phones have been fairly plain looking, but I'm actually a big fan of the 10 Pro's aesthetic, especially in this volcanic black color I've been using here. It is a little slippery though on account of that matte finish and the matte painted metal sidewalls, so a case may be a good idea if you're prone to phone related mishaps. Otherwise, this phone is comfortable and not excessively heavy. Just like its close relative, the Find X5 Pro from OnePlus parent brand Oppo, it's got a 6.7-inch display that's big enough to feel like a big phone, but not unwieldy like some larger handsets. While we're talking about touch and feel, it's worth pointing out that the OnePlus 10 Pro has some of the best haptics in any Android phone I've used. It's not something you can really show on video, but it is a noticeable upgrade and something that makes the device feel a lot more premium. Around front, you've got a suitably high-end, subtly curved Quad HD Plus screen with a 120Hz refresh rate. It's an LTPO 2.0 panel, so with that dynamic refresh rate, OnePlus claims it can draw less juice than a screen with a fixed 90Hz refresh rate. We'll get to battery life a bit later on, but in terms of display quality, I have absolutely nothing to complain about here. The panel's bright enough to use even out in direct sunlight, with peak brightness noticeably higher than the Pixel 6 Pro, and now it's tuned for color accuracy at both high and low brightness levels, so you shouldn't miss out wherever you're using this display. Once again, another best-in-class screen from OnePlus, and that's backed up by a powerful dual speaker system that's great for speakerphone calls and YouTube videos alike, with very minimal distortion even at high volume levels. Software-wise, this phone's running OnePlus's OxygenOS 12.1 based on Android 12, which may be a surprise depending on how closely you follow smartphone news. OnePlus software over the past year has been a whole saga, but to briefly recap, the plan originally was for this phone to run a new unified OS designed for both Oppo and OnePlus phones. That was scrapped after everyone agreed it was a terrible idea, and after OxygenOS 12 launched for the OnePlus 9 and was a broken, bug-riddled mess. So instead now we have OxygenOS 12.1, a much improved version compared to 12.0, and a new OxygenOS 13 coming later in the year that'll apparently be a lot closer to vanilla Android. So for now, what we have on the 10 Pro is kind of a hybrid of the old Oxygen OS and Oppo's Color OS. It's speedy, pleasant enough to use, and has a decent level of customization on offer for things like icons, accent colors, and the always-on display. Plus, you've got unique OnePlus features like Zen mode to disconnect from digital distractions, and work-life balance to avoid things like social notifications when you want to be productive, or to stop your work from following you home. As for Android 12's wallpaper color theming feature, well, it's kind of there in Oxygen OS 12.1, but not really. Google apps like the Dialer, Messages, and Gmail will pick up the color from your wallpaper and skin themselves accordingly, similar to Google Pixel Phone but without the choice of palette. Elsewhere, OnePlus apps will take their accent color from the color you choose under the personalization menu, so it's a little bit messy right now. And at the same time, although this software is based on ColorOS, don't expect any of the more exotic features from ColorOS 12 to make their way to the OnePlus 10 Pro. Things like the windowed mode for apps and the shortcut bar from the Find X5 Pro are nowhere to be found here. You do, however, at least get the extended RAM option from ColorOS to pad out the base 8GB of RAM with up to an extra 5 by siphoning off space from your internal storage. It works kind of like virtual memory on a PC, just gobbling up extra storage to use as RAM. While this software has mostly been stable, I've noticed one or two bugs here and there. Sometimes Google Photos would just hang at the splash screen. It's kind of a vintage bug that I've seen on a lot of older Oppo phones. And Android Central's India editor Harish Janalagada has had some issues with notifications not showing up from apps like Slack. Nothing show-stopping there really, just a couple early bugs that need fixing. So with Oxygen OS 12.1, you get a familiar feature set and a UI that looks fine enough, but in a few places is starting to feel a little bit dated. In fact, there's a fair bit of legacy Android 11 UI going on here, like the layout of the quick settings area and the media card here. It kind of feels like Oxygen OS is in a bit of a holding pattern right now, while everyone figures out how the big redesign in version 13 is going to shape up. Until then, what we have here is a software experience that works just fine, but isn't exactly awe-inspiring. The cross-pollination of Oppo technology has always been a strength for OnePlus when it comes to charging. And that's no different in the 10 Pro, with one annoying regional exception that we'll get to later. The headline numbers for quick charging in the OnePlus 10 Pro are the same as its sister phone, the Find X5 Pro. You've got wireless charging up to 50 watts with a compatible pad, or up to 80 watts over a cable thanks to the bundled 80 watt SuperVOOC plug. And the battery capacity has also been bumped up to 5,000 mAh, pretty standard for a high-end Android phone. That got me a reasonably comfortable full day of use most of the time, with between 4 and 5 hours of screen on time, basically mirroring what I got out of the technically very similar Find X5 Pro. And like that phone, I found the camera to be the biggest battery hog. On days when I wasn't taking too many photos, I could easily get past the 5-hour mark. But with such fast charging speeds, the lack of multi-day longevity isn't such a big deal. Quick example here, I put the OnePlus 10 Pro on its charger at 15% after a busy full day, and just over 17 minutes later it was back at 80%. The 10 Pro, like a few other phones, has a safe overnight charging feature that limits it to 80% until right before your scheduled wake-up time. So yeah, when just over a quarter of an hour is enough to get you out of the danger zone, it kind of changes how you think about battery life. The one caveat though is North America. Because OnePlus's 80-watt charging implementation isn't compatible with the 110-volt electrical systems used in the US and Canada, the 10 Pro only supports 65-watt wired charging in those countries. That's not ideal, but I also don't think it's a huge mark against this phone, and in any case, OnePlus says the difference in a full charge cycle only works out at around a couple of minutes. It's the second year of OnePlus's partnership with imaging giant Hasselblad, and the 10 Pro once again features prominent branding on the camera bulge itself and in the camera app in the form of that orange shutter key. On paper though, the rear camera hardware hasn't really changed since last year's OnePlus 9 Pro. The 10 Pro still has that Sony IMX789 main sensor, backed up by a 50-megapixel ultra-wide and the same comparatively potatoey 8-megapixel 3.3x telephoto. All round, this is still a pretty great camera experience though, and holds its own at around the £800 or $900 mark. The large main sensor is versatile and able to suck in enough light to go toe-to-toe with the Pixel 6 Pro in night photography. Meanwhile, the larger ultra-wide sensor continues to give OnePlus an edge, and this time OnePlus has added a new 150-degree super ultra-wide mode that's a lot of fun to use. Basically, it's a fisheye mode that gives you the sensor output without any of the distortion correction. OnePlus's night mode is pretty fantastic too, and with a little coaxing it can capture striking nighttime shots with white balance that's a bit more natural looking than pictures that I took for the Oppo Find X5 Pro. One interesting bugbear I noticed was that the night mode did sometimes need a bit of a nudge to capture shadow details fully. Basically, unless I cranked the exposure slider way up, so far that it looked overexposed in the viewfinder, I was often left with underexposed shadows. As for the telephoto camera, it's fine, but definitely not the greatest. On paper, the specs have barely changed since telephoto was first introduced in the OnePlus 7 Pro back in 2019, and using this camera in less than ideal light, it's clear it's just optically much weaker than an S22 or a Pixel 6 Pro. It's good for punching in slightly up to around 5 times, but anything beyond that is out of the question, and you can pretty much forget it when it comes to nighttime use. And obviously it gets completely stomped by the top Samsung cameras at 10 times or above, though these are much more expensive than the OnePlus 10 Pro. Nevertheless, I've enjoyed taking photos with the two other cameras on this phone. The Hasselblad color tuning gives shots their own distinctive look that has some of the vibrance that you get from a Samsung photo, only applied a bit more sparingly and with plenty of highlight detail. Meanwhile, it seems it's inherited enough of Oppo's color science to give backlit shots the same kind of HDR punch that you get from devices like the Find X5 Pro, but without looking as trippy as HDR pictures sometimes look from that phone. And OnePlus seems to have scaled back some of the quite aggressive sharpening that affected shots from the 9 Pro last year, which is a very welcome change. If you prefer a more stylized look, OnePlus has loaded a bunch of Hasselblad-inspired photo filters to help you out. It can really change the feel of a scene if that's your thing. And that's in addition to the Hasselblad X-Pan panoramic mode that we've already seen in the OnePlus 9 Pro and the Find X5 Pro, which takes an extra wide full-res capture from the ultra-wide sensor. In video, this camera has all the same tricks and features that I enjoyed using in the OnePlus 9 Pro last year. Things like 120 FPS 4K recording or super slow-mo at up to 1080p. And it also enjoys the AI highlighting feature from Oppo's cameras, as well as its super stabilization mode at up to 1080p. Stabilized 1080p footage was silky smooth, as was 4K footage taken from the ultra-wide camera, but weirdly I found that 4K video from the main camera wasn't anywhere near as stable, with stabilization often only kicking in when switching to that ultra-wide camera. It's especially noticeable in walking shots, as you can see here. Also on the video side, it's worth mentioning the log shooting mode, which is actually a holdover from the Oppo Find X3 Pro. Just like log on a professional camera, it can improve dynamic range by capturing a more washed out looking image that you can then later process in an app like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro. Once again though, you're limited to this slightly weird looking cinematic aspect ratio. The biggest omission though might be the lack of 4K video from either the telephoto or the new 32 megapixel selfie camera. The telephoto can record video and does a decent job considering its optical limitations, but you'll need to actively switch to 1080p mode first. And as far as 4K goes for vlogging, you're just out of luck, it maxes out at 1080p. That's a shame because the new selfie camera is actually pretty great. It captures a ton of detail and OnePlus's HDR algorithms cope really well with backlit scenes. In terms of image quality, a lot of these look like they could have been taken with the main camera from another smartphone. Portrait selfies hold up really well too, although OnePlus's edge detection around hair has been a little bit hit and miss in places, as you can see here. You can tackle this by adjusting the blur level before taking your shot, but there's no way to adjust it later. The same issues around hair also cropped up a few times when using the main camera in portrait mode, as well as the portrait selfie video feature. Basically, beware anything hair-like in the background of your footage lest it suddenly attach itself to your head. The OnePlus 10 Pro does manage to distinguish itself with a handful of new professional features though. The Hasselblad Pro mode gives you complete control of everything: focus, metering, white balance, ISO, the lot. And also lets you shoot in RAW to capture more light information that you can later edit in a professional app like Photoshop or Lightroom. And you can shoot in RAW, RAW Plus, or just spit out a regular JPEG. With RAW Plus, OnePlus says it's basically RAW but with a little bit of extra computational secret sauce. Personally, I'm not really the kind of smartphone photographer that spends a lot of time in these Pro modes. Mostly I found that Full Auto does a good enough job for me, and only rarely am I able to get a better shot out of RAW from a smartphone-sized sensor. Plus, if I'm taking photos on my phone, I often just don't have enough time to tweak all the necessary settings. By the time you've done that, often you've missed your shot. But I don't doubt the power of features like this, and for the right person, it could be a really fantastic shooting experience. In some ways, the OnePlus 10 Pro feels like less of a no-holds-barred flagship than the 9 Pro did last year. There's no IP certification for most versions of this phone. The higher-end 12GB plus 256GB version isn't coming to the US anytime soon. The camera hardware has been left mostly the same, as the likes of Google and Samsung have upped their game considerably. And the software is not really a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a thing, and it's going to be overhauled anyway in around 6 months when OxygenOS 13 launches. But it's still a pretty good buy for £800 or $900 with all the specs you expect to see at that price. And the lack of an IP rating, let's face it, probably doesn't matter anyway, given that the IP-rated OnePlus 10 Pros come right off the same production line as the ones without the rating. There is the problem with the starting price though, and its proximity to the Google Pixel 6 Pro. That's a phone that should also appeal to the traditional OnePlus core audience. But while the Pixel has better looking software and those value-added Google features, plus a far better telephoto camera, OnePlus fans can point to faster charging, more CPU horsepower, and those extra pro photo features thanks to the Hasselblad partnership. So this isn't a home run for OnePlus, but I do think it's a solid 4 stars out of 5, a decent all-round phone. And definitely worth a look if you're cross-shopping with a Pixel 6 Pro or S22 Plus. That's it for now. Let us know what you think of the OnePlus 10 Pro down in the comments and subscribe for more reviews like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.